All right, can everyone see the source sheet?
The source sheet. Yeah.
Okay.
It's loading slowly.
You got it, Jeff?
No, this computer's on its last leg. So it's something's coming now.
Okay. So we're in Parshat Chukat this week. Chukat opens with the description of the Para Aduma, the red heifer. And then it moves on. It contains within it both the death of Miriam and the death of Aharon, which are two really interesting narrative pieces to look at different times. And it has the punishment of Moshe and Aaron, which leads to them not being allowed to enter into the land of Israel. So it's a really interesting parsha. The Paraduma part of it is very technical, but there's a lot said about that as well. I think we explored that in previous shiurim. But we're going to focus on the punishment, the sin of Moshe and Aharon, and why it is that they were punished so harshly for what seems like maybe a minor crime. So we're in chapter 20. And again, I don't have a printout, so you'll have to tell me when I need to scroll down to make the English visible on the screen. Vayavo b'nei Yisrael kol ha'idam midbar tzin b'chodesh harishon vayeshiv ha'am b'kadesh v'tamat sham Miriam v'tikaver sham. So the entire congregation comes to the desert of Tzin in the first month, and they rest in Kadesh, and Miriam dies, and she was buried there in Kadesh. V'lo haya mayim la'ida v'yikahalu al Moshe v'al Aharon. There was no water for the nation, and they gathered against Moshe and Aharon. Of course, the juxtaposition of the death of Miriam with the lack of water is the basis for the very prominent Midrashic tradition that says that the entire 40 years they were wandering in the desert, they had water on Miriam's account, on Miriam's merit. Because as soon as she dies, that's when the water ceases. Vayarev ha'am I Moshe, vayomu le'mor, v'lugavanu b'bdei achenu lifnei Hashem. They quarrel with Moshe, saying, if only we had perished when our brothers perished at the instance of the Lord. V'lama hevitem et kahal Hashem el midbar hazel amud sham anachnu b'yireinu. Why did you bring the congregation of God to this desert to die here, us and our cattle? And why did you bring the congregation of God to this desert? Why did you take us out of Egypt to bring us to this place, this evil place, which is not a place of crops or figs or grapes, and there is no water to drink. So Moshe and Aaron go from in front of the people to the opening of the tent of meeting, and they fall on their faces, and the glory of God appeared to them. God speaks to Moshe, saying, Kach et hamateh v'hakel et ha'ida, ata v'aron achicha v'dibartem el hasela le'ineihem, v'natan meimav v'hotzita lahem mayim min hasela v'yishkita ta'ida ve'et v'ira. Take your staff and gather the people, you and Aaron, your brother, and speak to the rock in front of them, and it will give its water, and you will take water out from the rock and give water to the congregation and to their cattle. Moshe takes his staff from in front of God as he had been commanded. ויקהילו משה ואהרון את הקהל על פני הסלע, ויאמר להם שימו נא המורים, ומן הסלע הזה נוציא לכם מים. They gather the entire congregation in front of the rock.
Water the rock.
And Moshe says to them, listen, you rebellious ones, for will we take forth water for you from this rock? וירם משה את ידו, ויח את הסלע במטהו פעמיים, ויצאו מים רבים, ותשע עדה ובעירם. Moshe raises his hand and he hits the rock with his staff twice, and great amounts of water came forth, and the entire congregation drank and their cattle. ויאמר Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aharon, Ya'an lo ha'emantem bi lahakdisheni le'nei bnei Israel, lachein lo taviu et hakal hazeh el ha'aretz asher natati lahem. God says to Moshe and Aaron, since you did not believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the nation, therefore you will not bring the nation into the land that I am going to give to them. Hema me meriva asher ravu bnei Israel et Hashem vayikadesh ba. These are the waters of Meriva, meaning that the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, through which he affirmed his sanctity. Okay, it's a story that I think is probably familiar to all of us. What details jump out at you? Do you think that the punishment is fitting of the crime? What is the crime? Let's take a step back. What do Moshe and Aaron do wrong?
Well, God says you didn't trust me and affirm my sanctity.
Okay.
Whatever that means.
So they didn't trust in God. They did not affirm God's sanctity. Anyone else?
It's as if Moshe, in his wording, he's taking it personally. You're rebelling against us. I and Aaron, we are should we give you water from the rock and so on. He's making it not that he's the messenger, that he's following directions that he's gotten from Ribono Shel Olam, but rather something else.
Okay.
And that creates a big problem, maybe.
Okay, good. So Robert says that it's that they sort of take this attack personally, and they make it about an us versus them, as opposed to being the representatives of God in this, and they should be fighting for God's honor, not for their own honor. Is that an accurate summary, Robert?
I think so,
Okay.
Or it can be understood that way anyway.
Okay. Anyone else?
Calls them names. I mean, he calls them rebels,
Okay, he calls them rebels.
which implies that he's very angry with them.
Yeah, so that might be a bit piggybacking on what Robert said, but there's as we'll see, that there are those who really pick up on that language that they use as well.
But he was just supposed to order the rock to yield the water.
Yeah. So he hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock.
It wasn't,
Right. At the most basic level, that seems to be the issue, is that he didn't do what he was told to do. He didn't follow directions.
And something like this happened before.
Okay, good.
And you kind of wonder if there are resonances in people's heads about what happened before, even though now it's a much more dire circumstance, really, for them not to have water. I don't know. It's there's just a lot going on.
Yeah. So Anne correctly points out that this did happen before. Let's look at that again, because I don't have a printout. I can't display the Hebrew and the English in a way that you'll be able to read it. So we'll just look in the English. This is from Parshat B'Shalach, right after the splitting of the sea. You'll remember that first they complain that there's no food, and so God gives them the quail and then the man, and then they complain that there's no water. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole Israelite community continued by stages as Hashem would command. They encamped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moshe. Give us water to drink, they said, and Moshe replied to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you try Hashem? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst? Moshe cried out to Hashem, saying, "What shall I do with the people? Before long, they will be stoning me." And Hashem said to Moses, "Pass before the people, take with them some of the elders of Israel, and take along the rod with which you struck the Nile, and set out. I will be standing there before you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will issue from it, and the people will drink." Moshe did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. The place was named Massah and Merivah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tried Hashem, saying, "Is Hashem present among us or not?" Okay, so on the surface, it seems like a very similar incident that happened at the very beginning of their journey in the desert. What is similar and what's different between the incident in our Parsha and the incident in Parsha Beshalach?
Has a conversation with Hashem about what he should do in the midst of all of it. It's like he's on a communication line with Hashem throughout the whole thing. And that's just not apparent in this one.
In which one? In ours? In our Parsha?
Well, when the people come to him, he's not quite sure what to do. And in this case, in Moshe and Aaron, they do ask for something, for some help, and he gives them something to say. But it's in the rest of the repartee also, that in the other one where Moshe is still kind of has this conversation with Hashem, and it seems as if his own anger is blocking his communication with God when he really needed it.
Okay, so interesting, right? Because we certainly have God instructing Moshe in both instances, but Anne is right that in Sefer Shemot, in the first time, there's more of a dialogue, right? In our Parsha, Moshe and Aaron fall on their faces, and then God just tells them this is what you should do. Whereas in Parsha Beshalach, Vayitzak Moshe el Hashem limor ma e'aseh la'am hazeh o na'at tiskaluni. Moshe cries out to God and asks of him, "What should I do? They're going to stone me." And then God tells him. So there is more of a dialogue. That's interesting, and maybe we'll come back to that point a bit later in the shir.
But the relationship with Hashem is stated here. I will be standing there before you on the rock at Horeb.
Say that again, Arthur?
The relationship between Moshe and Hashem.
Yeah.
Hashem says, I will be standing there before you on the rock.
Okay, so as opposed to in our Parsha, where Moshe says, "Shall we bring water out of the rock?" Here it's very clear that God is the one bringing the water out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Many commentators pick up on that as well. But quite interesting is that what's the fundamental difference in the instructions that God gives in the two stories?
Well, he tells him to strike the...
Yeah. In the first time, God says, "Okay, you want water. There is no water visible. Take your staff, hit a rock, and water will come out."
Well, it doesn't say to hit it. It says to order the rock to yield its water. What does that mean? It says you shall.
Wait. In which one? In which one?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading the newer one.
Yeah. So in
What is
Shemot,
the-
it says,
What does it say in Shemot?
it says Hikita, you should hit it.
It does say to hit
Yeah,
it.
sorry. I can't display
Oh,
both
okay.
sources at the same time. I'm sorry.
Take the rock and
Strike the rock and water will issue from it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Malbim picks up on something very interesting I hadn't noticed before. We'll just do the English summary of it. But he says that the terms used in the two different passages are actually different. In Sefer Bamidbar, the rock is called a Selah, whereas in Shemot it's called a Tzor. Both of them translate as rock or as stone. But the Malbim says, and seems to be the case in modern Hebrew as well, that there's a difference between a Selah and a Tzor. A Selah is soft rock that often has natural springs of water behind it, as opposed to Tzor, which is a hard rock. By Choreb, in Sefer Shemot, where the rock was hard and there was no water, there was a big miracle, even if Moshe hit the rock and thereby brought forth water. However, in our Parsha, in Chukat, since we're dealing with Selah, with soft rock, the type that often has natural water behind it, Hashem wanted Moshe to speak to create another big miracle, that the rock listens and spontaneously provides water. By merely hitting the rock, however, it diminished the miracle. As skeptics proclaim, Moshe just moved some rock with his stick and found natural water. Okay, so I know we have gardeners in our group. I don't know if we have any geologists, but I thought this was a really interesting distinction that he makes. That the type of rock might be indicative of a different need and how to deal with the situation at hand. That there was naturally water behind the rock in our second instance, and so hitting it, isn't so miraculous. Maybe that's why God got so angry.
No, Moshe could be thinking, maybe doesn't, but could be thinking to himself. He says, well, Hashem did not tell me to strike the rock this time.
Yeah.
But why?
Right.
So what does
Why
that mean?
bring
He
why
tells me
bring
to
the
speak to
staff?
the rock, so it all hangs out that he really screwed up by hitting the rock.
Yeah, but well, yes and no, right? Because we have a concept of lifnei iver, that we don't want to improperly entice someone to do something they shouldn't do. So why does God tell Moshe to bring the staff if he's not supposed to do anything with the staff?
The people who were present at the previous instance where the staff was used to strike the rock and therefore miraculously it's the trigger. The people remember that.
Yeah, so that's a
And
good.
so the people expect it. And Moshe perhaps should have known the difference between the rocks, but
Yeah.
maybe he didn't, or he forgot, or he was
Yeah,
angry
so
or
that's
something. But curious thing, the term tsur, there's Ribono Shalom is referred to frequently as Tsur Yisrael.
Right.
And so that was a very important instance. This is a relatively lesser challenge to do what is needed to get the water. Maybe it's right under the surface, right behind the rock, and so on. But it's a public performance in a way that the leader does, and maybe he couldn't get over the practice that he had previously.
Yeah. So we'll come to that. But to your first point, Robert, it's not clear how many people witnessed the first miracle of water. Remember, we're now at the end of the 40 years. So most of the first generation has died out. There might be some around, some who did see it, the very young, maybe Shevet Levi, maybe some of the tribal leaders, but most of that generation has died out. So it's not.
Why should Moshe necessarily have a better memory than the few older folks might, or the children? The grandparents are telling the grandkids that, after we crossed into the Sinai, we didn't have water, and there was this event that occurred, and so on.
Yeah, so that might, right? We'll come to that at the end. But relying on the same miracle twice might be part of the problem. Right? That's part of what the Malbim and others are trying to get at. That Moshe had to amplify this miracle and make it unique. And if he simply did the same thing, again, it's pretty remarkable, I think, to hit a rock and water comes out. But that wasn't quite what the effect that God Hashem was looking for here. Okay, so let's move on. Rashi picks up. I forget who mentioned this at the opening of the Shir, but Rashi picks up on the fact that Hashem says, I think maybe Judy, you mentioned this. Yan lo ha'amantem bi lahakdisheni, you did not believe in me to sanctify. Rashi down here where it says bet in the Rashi, number 2 in the English, lahakdisheni, to sanctify me. She'ilu dibartem el hasela v'hotzi, hayiti mekudash le'nei ha'ida. Had you spoken to the rock and it gave forth water, I would have been greatly sanctified in the eyes of the nation. They would have said, this rock, which doesn't speak and doesn't listen, doesn't need any sustenance, it listens and does the will of God, all the more so should we. Okay, so the sin, according to this, wasn't necessarily in the hitting as opposed to the speaking, but in the chance, in the opportunity that was lost to sanctify God's name that they didn't do. Let's skip ahead to number 6, Rav Amital. Rav Amital says quite beautifully and quite powerfully, every time we reach this week's parsha and I read Rashi's explanation, I am startled and shaken anew. Moshe was not punished because he did something wrong, but rather because he could have acted in a better manner and he failed to do so. The verses describing the sin of Moshe, at least according to Rashi's interpretation, should similarly lead us to weep if we internalize the message which they convey to each and every one of us. Not only an improper act is considered a transgression that is deserving of punishment, but even refraining from performing a good and proper act. This should be a strong incentive for us to always consider what is the best and most appropriate thing we can do and to act accordingly. Okay, so sometimes the standard that we're held to is not about did we do or not do what we were supposed to, but what could we have done better, right? It's a standard of excellence. It's a standard of above and beyond that Moshe was being held to, and that's why he was punished so severely according to this approach. Let's go to the Rambam, Maimonides. This is his Shmona Prakim, which is his introduction to his commentary on Pirkei Avot. And we'll just summarize it. Someone else picked up on this explanation as well. The Rambam in general is a proponent of what we call the golden mean, the middle way, right? That you should never be too extreme in any character traits. You should always try to walk down the middle, with the exception of a few very powerful traits where you have to go to one extreme or the other. And one such trait is the trait of anger. Maimonides says that one has to go to the opposite extreme of anger. If you feel anger, you have to do whatever it will that will make you feel not angry at all. And Moshe here displayed anger when he says, Shimuna Hamorim, listen you rebellious ones. Right? He was angry at Bnei Yisrael because they were testing him, they were provoking him, and he lost it. He lost his temper. And he goes on to say that if Moshe, who was known to be the perfect prophet, the perfect, with perfect character traits, if he loses his temper, so that's really bad. And the people might have thought that God was so angry at them. If Moshe is reflecting anger, if Moshe is giving off anger, it must be that he's reflecting God's anger. But Rambam says God really wasn't so angry at them. God recognized that they needed water, and he provided the water for them. And so because Moshe was so angry and he lost it, that's why the Rambam says Moshe was punished so strongly and so severely. The next approach, also Arthur, I think you picked up on this one, is brought by the Ramban, who is quoting Rabbeinu Hananel. This is one of the great tests that they put God to in the desert. One of the best explanations that the Ramban has seen is the explanation brought by Rabbeinu Hananel. The sin is that they said, will we bring water from this rock? They should have said, will God bring water from the rock? As it says with the quail, when God gives you in the evening flesh or meat to eat. And it's known with every other miracle that God is the one who does the miracle. The people might have thought that Moshe and Aaron, through some magic or sorcery or mystical powers, that they on their own brought forth the water. And so the sin was that they attributed it to themselves rather than giving proper credit to Hashem. That's what the Ramban says in the name of Rabbeinu Hananel. Arthur, I think you had picked up on that in the text itself. Any questions on Maimonides or the Ramban's explanations? Okay, moving along. There's another detail that sort of gets, says my meeting's going to end in 10 minutes. If the meeting ends in 10 minutes, everyone just sign back in. I'm not sure why on earth it would say that. I should have unlimited. I don't know what's going on. Okay, so there's another detail that none of us picked up on in our first glance at the story, which is we take for granted that Moshe and Aharon are punished. God says Moshe and Aharon are punished. But who acts in our story?
Moshe.
Moshe. Moshe takes the staff, Moshe hits the rock. So the Medrash asks, Lama nipas Aaron? Why was Aaron punished? God clearly is punishing Aaron as well, but Aaron didn't do anything. It's like a parable to a creditor who comes to claim the threshing floor of the debtor as well as that of his neighbor. The debtor asked, I may be guilty, but what has my neighbor done? Moshe says the same thing. I recognize my mistake, but what did Aaron do that was so bad? Okay, so therefore Aaron is praised later on in the Chumash, but nonetheless, he's still punished for seemingly not having done anything.
He has a repeated behavior. V'yidom Aaron. His action in that case involving the deaths of his sons is to stand and do nothing. And that means that refraining from acting is a kind of action.
That's very interesting.
Like the previous statement about that one can be punished for not acting in some circumstances that Rav Amital refers to as being kind of depressing, because that means everybody has more of a challenge. Did I do the best that could have been done? Just avoiding committing murder and this and that and the other. What else should I have done that was a positive thing, that would have been a better thing, a good thing? And in this case, perhaps Aaron, as the brother of Moshe, could have maybe quietly whispered to him, don't hit the rock, or hit the rock. Now just back off and say, and God made the miracle or something, just to send the message that would be needed. And perhaps Aaron has his own habits of behavior. He's one of those people who doesn't waste words unless he thinks it's useful.
I mean, your explanation, I think, is spot on, and that's certainly the way that Rav Amital would have taken it, and Rav Lichtenstein more explicitly in source number 10. It's interesting that you connect it to the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, because there we generally praise Aaron's silence, right? His silence there is seen as an act of heroism, that he accepted the punishment or the divine judgment. And here, I think you're right. He should have spoken up. He should have said, Moshe, that's not what God said to do. He should have jumped in and done something more. So that's interesting to think. Is this sort of like a fundamental character trait of Aaron, right? We think of him as being the Ohev Shalom or Rodev Shalom, the person who puts himself out there to bring peace between fighting individuals. But maybe there is something more about Aaron's inaction. That's something to think about in for future shirim. So thank you, Robert. But in this
Rabbi?
instance, yeah.
I came across something this year, and I'm sorry, I just don't remember where I saw it. But if we think about what when Aaron died, there was a mention of mourning that went on. And
Yeah.
also when Moshe died, but
Yeah.
not when Miriam died. And on the basis of that, there's somewhere, I don't know if it's in a midrash or where it is, somebody's observation that they never did do adequate mourning for the loss of Miriam. And the way that I've been thinking about that since I saw this today, you know, trying to think if there are any threads that come up. And this is one of them, I think, that Aaron is reverting to a kind of behavior in the face of the sorrow of
interesting.
Miriam.
Interesting.
And that the psychological challenge always when someone passes is for the person, you know, they talk about stages of grief and
Yeah.
so on, but I think of it psychologically as what is it that that person supplied for me in my life that I will miss so terribly. And then if one can get close enough back to Hashem through that process with the help of other people, one finds that in fact Hashem will provide for you what it is that you need in a different way perhaps, but it's like you've recaptured the source of life. And clearly Moshe is in trouble himself. He's not in control of himself the way he should be. Here's somebody who saved his life. Here's somebody whose husband jumped first into the water. I mean, you know, there's a lot that could be brought into this. I mean, I know this is a theoretical way of getting at it because I haven't looked at it.
I think that's a beautiful explanation. I am now with you and Robert and now fully convinced that there is a strong connection between the death of Nadav and Avihu in this story. So thank you both for that. You're right. We don't see any mourning for Miriam, and this is what happens immediately afterwards. And so maybe part of what's going on is that Moshe and Aaron again are being asked to navigate their role as leader and as individual. And again, that's a very difficult thing to navigate. And Aaron does, you know, according at least to this reading, doesn't live up to his responsibility as a leader, maybe because he's too overcome with grief and with mourning. It is very interesting that we don't see any mourning for Miriam when she dies, but when she is struck with sarat,
yes,
the people, right, we're told that they don't travel for as long as she's in quarantine outside of the camp. And it's a debate among the Farshim, among the commentators, but my absolute favorite read is those who say that they didn't travel as an act of disobedience, that the clouds that indicated it was time to travel were moving, and the nation said, nope, we're not going anywhere without Miriam, out of a sign of respect for her. So it's even more stark that there wouldn't be any mourning for her when she dies, because they were so clearly so connected to her while she was alive. So that gives us a lot to think about. Thank you to Anne and to Robert for those beautiful comments. Okay, I'm getting more and more nervous because I don't know, do you guys have the remaining meeting time on your screen, or is that just mine?
we haven't gotten a message comparable to yours.
Okay, so we'll have to see what happens, but it says there's only a minute and a half left, so.
It says on the frame of the screen I've got here, Zoom meeting had 40 minutes, but there's a clock that says 30 minutes, 25 seconds or something. So we have at least 9.5 minutes.
Well, that's according to yours. I only have a minute left on mine. Okay, so let's quickly, I don't know, if we get kicked off, I think let's just quickly run through it. So the next two theories, explanations are about failures of leadership in a different sense. Rav Yaakov Meidan, who's one of the Rosh Yeshiva now at Yeshivat Har Etzion, says that the fault was in Moshe and Aaron's initial reaction, which is Vayiplu al Paneim. They fall on their face. When the people come to them in crisis, the people come to them in need, they don't act. They again rely on God. They just go to they leave the people, they go to the tent of meeting, and they fall on their faces, expecting God to take care of it. And so in his read of it, the failure and the punishment was because they did not act as leaders. they should have at this point, 40 years leading the people, they should have at least calmed the people down and known to approach God. If they didn't have an answer by themselves, they should have been able to do something more constructive when the complaint came to them. And finally, there's a beautiful, beautiful analysis of this story from Rabbi Held, whose writings we've seen often. And he says that it all goes back to the original story in Sefer Shemot,